Well, Rachel, this is a terrific time to be thinking about the future of the Labour Party. Here we are, Labour having been catapulted ahead in recent weeks. It was, Harold Wilson who said very short time in politics. This has felt a very short time indeed. And you've been shadowing the invisible man, the vanishing Chancellor, who we haven't seen very much of, and he's had an awful lot to hide from, if you consider the trouble that the Tories are in at the moment. If you look at just this recent spate of scandals, but scandal upon scandal upon scandal, I think we're going to talk about some of them. The cost of living crisis, which is only going to get considerably worse in April. The NHS crisis, which we've been talking about, which Keir's been talking about. Public services everywhere on their knees. And Labour, this is the moment when Labour has to seize this turning of the tide. So I'm going to start by asking you a broad question. What does Labour need to do next to seize this moment?
Well, thank you very much, Polly, and it's great to be here at the Fabian conference and to be here in person with you. I think that the shift in the polls is obviously fantastic news, but it's something that Labour have got to take advantage of rather than just celebrate. So the fact is, being ahead in the polls means that people are more interested in what Labour have got to say than if we were 5 or 10 points behind, for the obvious reason that it's not impossible to imagine a Labour government, and so people are quite keen to know what we would do if we did get our hands on power again after what is now nearly 12 years of opposition. So we've got to use this moment, which is why Keir spoke today about his plans for how we now need to learn to live with COVID, and Wes has been talking about that as well. It's why last weekend I spoke about our plan to keep people's bills, their gas and electricity bills, as low as possible, £200 off everyone's bills, getting rid of VAT on gas and electricity bills, and support in a very Labour way for people who need it the most, families with children and pensioners who need it most, with a huge expansion of the Warm Homes discount, all paid for through a windfall tax on the excess profits of the oil and gas companies. So some distinctive Labour policies rooted in our values, but speaking to the challenges that people face right now. So we've got a big opportunity, but we've got to seize this opportunity. Yes, of course, to hold the government to account for their numerous parties, but also to set out our agenda for government, because I think that's what people are yearning for. What would you do? We hear again and again in the chamber, on the television, etc. And we've used this chance, now that we're ahead in the polls, to really set out some of those plans, whether it's on health or on the cost of living crisis.
Right, and I think what a lot of people in this room have been asking, and have been asking me to ask, is how radical a Chancellor will you be? You have a problem about, Labour always has a problem about its credibility, its fiscal credibility. But when you think of George Osborne arriving with his first budget a month after arriving in power in 2010, you think that he hit the ground running, wielding his big axe, and he cut everything to pieces. He made it absolutely clear what he was doing, where he was going, told the big lie, you maxed out your credit card. What's going to be the Labour equivalent where you plant your flag in your first budget and say, this is where everything changes?
Well, I'll be planting my big wind turbine, because our big commitment is our climate investment pledge. £28 billion a year for every year of this decade to decarbonise our economy. And, of course, that will help us to meet our targets of getting to net zero as quickly as possible. But also, and you see this with the energy price crisis we've got at the moment, it will help people's bills low. If the government hadn't have dithered and delayed for the last decade or so, then we would have had that investment in renewables and nuclear and hydrogen, etc., and insulating our homes rather than the shambles of the green homes discount from this government, and we wouldn't have energy bills so high because we'd have energy security and homegrown energy in this country. So that would be my radical and urgent action that I would take if I was an incoming Chancellor. Now, we've got a Chancellor at the moment who gives a budget which is, one of the biggest tax-raising budgets we've ever had, and then at the end of the budget says, but that's not what I am. I'm a low-tax-cutting Conservative. I'm a Thatcherite, really. It's just, this budget seems to be raising quite a lot of taxes. This Chancellor, who wants to be Prime Minister, doesn't know what sort of Chancellor he wants to be. He has that position and power and authority that, frankly, I would love to have, but he doesn't know what to do with it. I go in with a plan, and that is, of course, about, taxing fairly, spending wisely, growing the economy. But I think the exciting bit that I hope will excite all of you in this room, and voters as well, is about that huge investment to create good jobs in all parts of the country, to decarbonise our economy and to secure that energy security as well.
Now, socialism, language of priorities, we know that. Do you sometimes sort of wake up in the middle of the night thinking how daunting it's going to be when you arrive there in the Treasury and you look around you at the wasteland, you look at the desperate need in every single department, you look at, at all the sessions that we've been having today, time and time again, stories of real shortage of incredibly threadbare public services, poverty worsening, schools, teachers still paid 8% less than they were in 2010. We've heard about the state of health and everything else wherever you look, and you want to invest at the same time. How are you going to describe those priorities? How are you going to make your way through that thicket of demands?
I mean, there are so many parallels to what Labour inherited in 1997. I joined the Labour Party aged 17 in 1996 because when I was at school, our sixth form was 2 prefab huts in the playground. Our library was turned into a classroom because there were more students than there was space, and there were never enough textbooks to go around. And I felt very strongly that the government we had then didn't care about families like mine, communities like mine. And my kids were born in 2013 and 2015. And, I fear that they're having the same experience growing up now as I did in the 80s and 90s, because we've got a government that is not on the side of our public services and ordinary families. And, we were in one of the sessions earlier today with Jonathan Ashworth, and someone made the point that 1 in 7 children are going hungry today. I mean, that means 4 children in every classroom or more, because class sizes are going up. And it is heartbreaking knowing that in my son's class, 4 kids there are probably going hungry, and same in my daughter's class. And it's the same as we had in the 80s and 90s. So we've got a playbook here, because Labour did transform those public services in the 13 years that we were in power. We rebuilt schools and hospitals. We got waiting lists down. We lifted children and pensioners out of poverty. And friends, we will do it again. When we elect a Labour government, we will do those things again, and we will turn around those public services and also turn around the cost of living crisis that we've got today. Now, it is important, as in 1997, that we explain how we will pay for everything we do. I don't think that there is free money going. I don't think there is a magic money tree. But I do think there are choices to be made, and very different choices to what this government said. Now, last weekend, after we announced the windfall tax on the North Sea oil and gas companies, Nadine Zahawi went on television and said that this was an ill-thought-through policy because, and I'm not kidding, oil and gas companies are struggling right now. I mean, come to Leeds West, mate, because I can tell you who are struggling, and that is ordinary constituents of mine, not the oil and gas companies, who are actually going to make record profits this year. And so there's no magic money tree, but there are choices that we can make, and Labour would make incredibly different choices from what this government are making. And that's why I set out in my conference speech that we would end the ridiculous system that private schools there's no VAT on the school fees. They don't pay business rates. Private equity companies, if you take over a company in private equity, and you pay yourself a bonus, you pay capital gains on that bonus, 20% rather than 40 or 45%. We would close those loopholes, and we would tax the oil and gas companies to keep other people's bills low. Those are some of the different choices that an incoming Labour government would make.
And that amounts to a kind of wealth tax by taxing capital gains?
Well, look, I mean, some of the detail, I think it's pretty clear what the direction of travel is. So, the private equity and the private schools stuff we announced at conference, just last weekend, the oil and gas, and there'll be more to come ahead of the next election. But when the government put through the national insurance increase in Parliament, and I'm really pleased to say I have an unlikely ally in Jacob Rees-Mogg, who, despite voting for I never thought that I would count Jacob Rees-Mogg as an ally of mine, but you take what you can get in politics. And despite voting for the increase in national insurance, it turns out that he actually thinks it's a bad idea. And so do we. And we think it's a bad idea because to tax ordinary working people and businesses employing those working people at a time when the costs of everything, whether it is a weekly food shop, filling up your car with petrol, the gas and electricity bills, are all going up, and the government decides that this is the moment to increase taxes, not on the wealthy, the people with the broadest shoulders, not on the struggling oil and gas companies, but on ordinary working people. Again, those are the wrong choices, and Labour would be making very different ones.
So what do you make about levelling up? Does it mean anything at all? Is there a Labour levelling up? What do you reckon is going to be in this white paper? What does it mean as a concept, if anything?
Well, I'm all for levelling up, or whatever you want to call it. The problem is we just don't see very much of it. On budget day, the Chancellor sort of started to troll me on Twitter and was encouraging me to welcome investment in my constituency, but I forgot actually, but I was supposed to send him an A to Z for Christmas because his geography is clearly not very good, because he wanted me to welcome some improvements on a ring road on the edge of Leeds between two roundabouts. I mean, first of all, it's not in my constituency, but secondly, I'm not sure when people think about levelling up, they think, and what I really mean is some tarmac on the ring road between Pudsey and Horsforth. I mean, it's welcome. I'm not going to sit on the road and stop it from going ahead. I mean, I'm sure it'll be helpful, but it is not exactly the summit of my ambitions when it comes to levelling up. And I would just say that, one other thing. There's a fantastic story, or sort of an awful story, depending on how you look at it, over Christmas about one of the beneficiaries of levelling up funding. And this was a lord in Sussex, a Tory lord, of course, a Tory lord in Sussex who got £300,000 for tarmacking his driveway. Again, I mean, I've never been on his driveway, and I hope it's a lot better afterwards. It must have been a terrible condition to need 300 grand. But this is just not serious. This government, they say that they're in favour of levelling up. They say, they're going to get Brexit done. But, the sort of proof is in the pudding, and none of these things are going that well. I want to see levelling up, but I don't want to see it all come from Westminster. I don't want to see local authorities and communities having to bid into a pot, and Rishi Sunak and his civil servants at the Treasury having to decide between all these competing schemes. I want Andy Burnham and Tracy Brabin and Dan Jarvis to be making decisions about how to spend money in their communities, not civil servants who, frankly, probably have never been to these places, or the Chancellor who's making the decisions for purely political reasons rather than reasons of need or opportunity. And I think that, levelling up, it's not charity. This is about all of our economic prosperity and ensuring that all parts of the UK can fire on all cylinders and create good quality jobs in all parts of the country. So I want to see levelling up. It's just that we haven't seen any of it so far.
I think you'd be the first Chancellor we would have heard actually being willing to let Treasury money go if you're talking about devolving more of it.
Yeah, no, it's something I do feel very passionately about because, I just don't think that civil servants and politicians in Westminster are going to be the best people to make individual decisions about, the merits of one transport scheme or one housing scheme or one investment in offshore wind against another, because they're not connected with those places. And I think you'll get better value for money, and that is something, as an incoming Chancellor, I care hugely about. Better value for money, more bang for your buck, more local support, if these decisions were taken at the appropriate level. And so, yes, I would want to be a chancellor that hands power to the elected politicians in these parts of the country. And also, I think that we need more devolution in more parts of the country, because unless you live in a city region, there's really very little additional devolution of power in the last 12 years. So I'd like to see more of that.
Something we've heard from ministers, from you, from Kiev, over and over again, and I think it's beginning to get through, is their incompetence. We've had the crony contracts, we've had wastages one after another. I think you've been pursuing wastage as a particularly strong point.
Yeah, I think there's a link between all these things, the crony contracts, the parties. It's a government that's been in power for too long, that is arrogant and out of touch with the people who they, were elected to serve. And on the issue of, the Tories have, for too long, in my view, had this reputation of economic competence. How can you say you're economically competent and can be trusted with public money when £3.5 billion have gone in contracts to friends and donors of the Conservative Party? We've found some numbers through a series of questions that we've done to the Treasury, that £6.5 billion of fraud went in the business loan scheme during COVID. Companies that were only registered days, or in fact, in one case, a company registered one day, the next day applies for hundreds of thousands of pounds of COVID support money and got all that money. Other companies who bid twice and got the money twice in their bank account, and only a fraction of the companies that have done this are actually being pursued by the Treasury. If the government hadn't allowed that fraud to occur, that would be £6.5 billion. That would be enough not to have to go with the national insurance increase on employees. So again, it is about choices here, and it's about competence. And it's about respect, I think, for taxpayers' money. Because when people are so hard-pressed, and they are at the moment, when people are so hard-pressed and you're asking them to pay taxes and additional taxes, I think you've got to be really confident that you're using that money wisely. And I don't want to go to my constituents and say, look, I've got to come back and ask for more because I'm afraid, I've wasted some of your money. But also because I believe that public services can transform people's lives. I mean, my school transformed my life. My teachers, sowed seeds of ambition in me that, without them, I don't know whether I would have got to where I am today. So I believe that public services can transform people's lives. And so when you're wasting money, that's money that's not going into the front line of the health service or education or building new homes. And so I do want to get value for money for every pound of taxpayers' money spent. And I think there is this casual disregard for taxpayers' money, perhaps for people who have never had to work very hard for anything in their life, that they don't know the value of anything, including taxpayers' money. And so the waste and the cronyism, I think it goes to the heart, really, of this government and who they govern for. They govern for their friends, their cronies. As long as the economy and things are going okay for them, that's all right. I want to govern, and Keir wants to govern for the whole country in the national interest. This government are governing in the interest of a very small set, and that seems to be a set of Tory donors and friends.
Is that what you meant by everyday socialism? You wrote a Fabian pamphlet. Maybe people mightn't have expected you to use the word socialism with such comfort, but it doesn't concern you.
So I've written a number of pamphlets and essays around what I call the everyday economy, and one of them, Everyday Socialism, was published by the Fabians about 3 years ago, I think it was now. And this idea of the everyday economy for me is about focusing on the things that matter in people's lives, and I think that is good work, the places that we live, and our families. I think that, in essence, those are the things that matter to people, but how much of Treasury and economic policy focuses on those basic needs and priorities in people's lives. And I want to see a reorientation of economic policy to focus on those everyday issues. And I think if you sort of think about industrial strategy, it might help explain what that means. So this government scrapped its industrial strategy, but even when they had an industrial strategy, it focused on the high-tech, high-skill, high-productivity sectors of the economy. You always have an industrial strategy for electric vehicles or the life sciences or AI, and so we should, because they're important sectors of the economy. But the parts of the economy that employ the most people, social care, retail, hospitality, there's never been an industrial strategy for any of those. And if I was Chancellor, I would be working with Johnny Reynolds on an industrial strategy, not just for those high-performing parts of the economy that have already got high-skilled and high-paid jobs, but an industrial strategy to drive up pay and terms and conditions and productivity and opportunity in those parts of the economy that employ huge numbers of people, but where poverty pay and poor working conditions are often endemic. And so that's what I mean about focusing on the everyday and a reorientation of our economic policy to focus on the lives that people live in all parts of the country.
Thank you. Now, we have, Rachel has to leave very promptly to catch a train at 4:30. She has 12 minutes to run across the road. I hope she doesn't run across the road. So we had better take questions. I don't know if there are questions online that somebody was going to hand me, if there's anybody out there. But yes, I'll take the man with his hand up there. And where's the woman? Where were they? I'll take you first.
Thanks very much, Rachel. This was absolutely brilliant. Kanishka from Leicester. Over the last decade and a bit, Britain's consistently exported its most productive inventors to the United States. And at the same time, in Leicester, despite a far higher skill base and younger age profile, most people growing up in families in Leicester end up leaving Leicester. What is the kind of 10, 20-year most ambitious, forward-looking vision for what Britain looks like economically in the world and in Leicester?
Right, next one. Any women anywhere? And if so, wave your hand very... Yes, there's a woman there with the green mask.
Thanks. I have a question about, Rachel has talked about the energy crisis, and I've heard today how Labour has said that if they were reimagining a green future and energy, they'd be very much talking about renewables. You mentioned planting the wind turbines. I was going to ask if Labour is going to completely turn away from nuclear energy, because there are also some exciting developments like thorium, which cannot be repurposed for nuclear weapons and is also much more adaptable to renewable electricity. And so what would be your response to being a creative approach to nuclear energy as a sustainable alternative to the current problems that we face with our current energy crisis?
Okay, one more. Right away. So I make you run all the way to the front. Oh, you've got one there, yes.
One of the things the Labour government will have to do when it comes in is to take part in the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU, which is scheduled for 2025. What would be your priorities to improve that deal with the EU? I'm sorry, I'm George Perrett, Society of Labour Lawyers.
And this counts as how do you make Brexit work, is
it? Great questions. So in terms of keeping innovators and inventors in this country, I think that, you look at our country, and I don't know if any time in my lifetime we've ever had such opportunities. And yet, if you look at the growth figures or you look at the productivity data, and they're appalling, there's a huge mismatch between the opportunities out there and our economic performance at the moment. We need to take greater advantage of some of the huge advantages we've got, like our fantastic universities and our innovators, and ensure, I think, that we buy, make and sell more in Britain, so that we keep jobs here and that also those jobs are distributed across the whole of the UK. And I think that you can't have levelling up, actually, without the climate investment pledge that I've set out, because the great thing about the climate investment pledge, the £28 billion a year, is that those jobs are not going to be created predominantly in London and the South East, although I think green finance is a huge opportunity for the UK. But the jobs are likely to be created in the former coastal communities, the former industrial heartlands of the UK. And in terms of Leicester, we've got one of Leicester's finest MPs, along with Liz Kendall, in the audience there, so he can tell you about. I would say when George Osborne introduced his his pasty tax. Do you remember the omni-shamble budget in 2012? Jonathan said to me, it's not just a pasty tax, Rachel, it's also a samosa tax. And you need to come to Leicester this week with me to meet small shops and businessmen who are selling samosas who are devastated by this. So we went and we did all this work, and it turns out there was never a tax on samosas, but we had a very nice afternoon out. In terms of the energy crisis, thank you for that question. I do feel that the reason, and I think it's really important for Labour that we prosecute this argument that we are in this mess now with the energy crisis because of the decisions that the Tories have made. Of course, there is a global increase in gas and electricity prices, but we are uniquely exposed in Britain for three reasons, I think. First of all, the government got rid of the gas storage facilities in 2017, and so we don't have those reserves and that security that would be so helpful right now. Second, for more than a decade, we have dithered and delayed, as I said, on new nuclear, on energy storage, and on investment in renewables. And thirdly, we have failed to regulate the market properly. So it is like Northern Rock all over again, but in the energy market. Anybody could come into this market and sell gas and electricity to the consumer with no hedging, with no reserves. And when they went under, the bill is footed entirely by other bill payers. There's no liability at all for the companies who have made those reckless decisions. And as a result, those costs are going to go directly on our bills if the government does nothing about it in April. And so we do now need to use this moment as a wake-up call to invest in some of these renewable technologies. So, a bit like my answer to the first question, we've got such huge potential as a country, such huge potential when it comes to this renewable energy and in nuclear as well. Our geography means that we are in such a good position to benefit from offshore wind and onshore as well, from tidal energy, from solar energy sometimes, but also from carbon capture and storage because of our heritage with North Sea oil, for example. But nuclear has got to be part of the mix. Particularly because having a base load that is always there, even when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, nuclear is an important part of the mix. But there's been no new nuclear has come on tap under the 12 years of this Conservative government. George, your question on Brexit. As Keir said, I think as recently as this morning, it's not enough to just get Brexit done. We've got to make Brexit work. I expect that most of us in this room wish that we weren't in the situation we're in, but we are. We are where we are. But there are practical things that can be done to make the deal an awful lot better than it is now. And just a few practical things. I think we need a bespoke veterinary deal with the EU. New Zealand have a veterinary deal with the EU, and we don't. That is madness. It would ease a lot of the problems between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but also between United Kingdom and the rest of Europe. We need a mutual recognition of professional qualifications to help, particularly in the services sector. We need recognition in financial services. We need to support our fantastic creative industries, where at the moment artists touring abroad have to get a visa for every country that they enter. So there are loads of practical things, but the government, since they got the deal on Christmas Eve last year, have done nothing to sort out some of the gaps in this patchwork deal. But I think most of all, it comes from the sort of relationship that we want to have. This government wants to have, for political reasons, an antagonistic relationship with the European Union. It is in their interest to keep that antagonism going. Labour would have a very different approach. We regard our European neighbours as our friends, whether it comes to our security, whether it's from the threat from Russia or elsewhere, or when it comes to our economic self-interest. Working together with our European neighbours and our partners is in our national interest, and we would do that as friends, not as adversaries, which seems to be the approach of this government.
Right. Well. Let's have some more. There's one here.
Martin Platt. I arrived in the UK in 1977 from South Africa, and I honestly thought we were on the way to hell. I mean, there wasn't a week when there wasn't another major industry that was collapsing, one after the other, I mean, from British Leyland onwards. And yet, we were number 5, more or less, in the world then. We're number 5 now. Nobody ever talks about the fact that we are a success. What can you say about that?
Question. Somebody there. Any more women anywhere? Yes, and in that, probably in the red cardigan over there.
George Byrne. Okay, so when we take over from the Tories, it's pretty clear that, when not if, it's pretty clear that we're going to inherit a mess. That's absolutely apparent. In that context, economic growth is going to be absolutely fundamentally important for whatever we can achieve as a Labour government. What are the priorities, specifically thinking about the growth agenda, that you would put forward at the next general election?
Thank you. Hi, my name's Maura, and you probably all know now I'm from Durham. Every time I think about the wastage around COVID-19 spending and the contracts that went to people's friends, I think about the rail lines in County Durham and the wider North East that are necessary for our economy that just aren't going to get built. Now that the High Court has ruled that the fast track procurement has been illegal, is there any way a Labour government could claim some of that money back and build my railways? Very thank you.
So Martin's question, we are a hugely successful economy, but we also have huge inequality in our country. As I said earlier, 1 in 7 children today going hungry, the number of children, the number of pensioners in poverty. Labour reduced those numbers hugely, and they've gone right back up again. I do think there's just so many parallels from what we inherited in 1997 and what we will, I hope, inherit at the next election. But we have huge resources and huge potential. Some of the best universities in the world. Our geography means that we're in a great position to benefit from the move to a net zero economy. Some great companies. But there's also a problem that the geographical dispersion of those companies is too narrow. And we've got huge regional inequalities on top of everything else. So I do want to reduce those gaps between rich and poor, between London, the South East and the rest of the country, and ensure that we make the most of all the potential. And it links really to I think, is it George, to George's question. In the 13 years that Labour were in government, the average growth rate was 2.3% a year. In the years of the Conservative government leading up to the pandemic and not including it, average growth was 1.8% a year. By the end of this Parliament, the Office of Budget Responsibility are forecasting that our economy will grow by just over 1% a year, and the Bank of England is even less optimistic than that. The truth is, it is impossible both to improve public services and to improve people's standard of living when you don't have economic growth. Economic growth is the missing ingredient, and this point I think is really worth making. The Tories have become a high tax party. Why is that? It's not because they like high taxes, I don't think they do. It's because they have become a low growth party. And if you don't have economic growth and you have got public services in such dire need, as Jonathan and Wes will attest to, then you've got to find the money from somewhere. And that money's not coming from growth. We can't use the proceeds of growth to invest in these public services because growth there is none. And so as a result, they've had to become a high tax party to fund the public services that are in great need. And so I think you are absolutely right that we've got to have a plan and a strategy for growth. Now, this week in Parliament, on Monday, we voted for the Chancellor's new fiscal rules. When I say they're the Chancellor's fiscal rules, you wouldn't know that because he hasn't actually bothered to turn up to Parliament this week. So desperate is he to hide from the unfolding crisis. And so worried is he about having any photos with him and Boris Johnson in it, that he didn't actually turn up to set out his fiscal rules. But his fiscal rules limit the amount of a capital investment that we can spend as a country to 3% a year, despite the fact that our investment in the infrastructure that the third question asked about is, I think, something like the 32nd out of 35 developed countries. But he's put a cap, an arbitrary cap on that investment. No business would say we are going to limit investment. Whatever the opportunities are out there, we're going to limit our investment. And that limit of investment means that the government are not investing in the renewables, they're not investing in the train infrastructure and the housing infrastructure and everything else that we desperately need. And as a result, growth will just stay where it is, flatlining along the floor. And so we need a proper plan. The Climate Investment Pledge is part of that. Our plans to buy, make and sell are part, buy, make and sell more in Britain, part of that. Our plans for improving education, but also adult skills are part of that as well. And a serious plan for levelling up the country, because we know that through devolution and giving more power and control to local people will result in better decisions and better value for money. So I think you're absolutely right to point to the importance of economic growth. And the third question, first of all on government waste and then on rail lines. Today is the 4th anniversary of the collapse of Carillion. I co-chaired with the amazing Frank Field the inquiry into the collapse of Carillion. And we're 4 years on, and the conclusions that Frank and myself and our committees came to around government waste, about poor government decisions on procurement, they're all as true, if not more so today than they were then. At least with Carillion, we didn't uncover any relationships between government ministers and the directors of Carillion. Now the problem is that, you've got any mate of a Tory minister, and if they haven't got a contract, you might as well take them off your Christmas list. They obviously don't care that much about you. So you've got this situation where 4 years on, after the collapse of Carillion, where lessons should have been learned about the way to do government procurement, it's actually got much worse during that time, with cronyism added in to the huge wastes in the use of public sector money. And I said at conference to all those people who got contracts but failed to deliver, because it's not just that they got money, they didn't even deliver on those contracts. You had PPE that had to be thrown in the bin, you had testing equipment that couldn't be used. I said at conference, and I'll say again in the election campaign, we want our money back. If I was in business, if any of us in business, and I worked in the private sector before I became an MP, if you signed a contract with a company to deliver something and they didn't deliver, you wouldn't still pay them. You would go to court if necessary and you would get your money back, and that is what this government should do. And if they don't do it, an incoming Labour government will. And let me just finally say I couldn't agree more with the rail lines. The reason that I have to leave at 4:30 on the dot is because tonight, to get to Leeds, I have to get a train to Tamworth and then change there and then go to Leeds, because there's no services to Leeds or back this weekend, and it's going to take me 3 hours and 40 minutes. So when you're having a drink in the pub afterwards or you go home for dinner with your family, spare a thought for me.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. You better go. Don't run across the Euston Road.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely to be here with you today.